We always want to express our gratitude to Jean Budig for establishing this award. We have one in special education and one for just in education in general. And it's quite remarkable that a former chancellor felt that that teaching was important enough that he would invest the kind of money that he did in recognizing and awarding faculty at the university for exemplary teaching. Elizabeth joined the KU faculty in 2012 as chairperson in the Department of Special Education. She received her doctoral degree in 1985 at the University of Northern Colorado in special education. She's currently a professor in the Department of Special Ed. One of her nominators about Elizabeth said the following: Elizabeth is ideal for this honor because of her sustained and outstanding contributions to educational research and teacher, educator, and research preparation in the field of special education. Her program of research and teaching spanned more than, why did they write this, a quarter century, is that there? And focuses on system change for inclusive education and professional learning in urban schools. At KU, as chair, Elizabeth was responsible for a number of initiatives. For example, she led the redesign of the doctoral program, and our doctoral program has changed quite dramatically in special education since her tenure. And she also led the department into the online degree programs in special education. We started with no students in 2014, and today we have over 600 in our online master's degree programs. Her visibility and outstanding contributions to inclusive teacher education are reflected in many honors and awards that she has been recognized for. A few examples, in 2005, she was the UNESCO Chair on Inclusive Education, and in 1998, she was the President of the Council of Exceptional Children's Teacher Education Division. She certainly has made outstanding contributions to research and teaching in the field. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth for her talk, From Teaching to Learning, Shifting Roles and Identities. Elizabeth.
So, you know, the day has finally arrived where I actually have to say something, and it's kind of a really good moment for me to be able to talk about the work that I've been doing and the work that I've been getting really excited about as I watch the process of our doctoral students moving from novices into full-blown researchers, and what they have been teaching me about their work and how their work will transform the next generation of teaching and learning that goes on in our public schools. And I want to focus today particularly on the idea that we are in a moment of very rapid change, and that rapid change is on us because of the technology world that we live in, because of artificial intelligence, because of the way that things far outside of the field of education are shifting the experiences of children who come to school. In many ways, for ill and for good, the world is changing, and the tools that children need to make meaning of the world around them are also changing. And that means that what teachers know and what they can do must also change. And this pivot from how shall I be a teacher to how shall I support learning is going on right now in schools. And I want to talk today about that specific shift. And I want to draw on a number of different disciplines, from neuroscience to anthropology to sociology to cultural psychology to educational psychology, and to our own field in special education, to bring together what I think are very powerful tools for the relationship between what happens between adults in educational settings and the students that they are there to support and to learn. And so that's the focus of what I want to talk about today. There are lots of things that I could be talking about, but for me, how we learn and how we make meaning of the world around us and the commitments that we bring to that and what we hope will become hallmark of an educated person for the next generations is incredible. The turmoil in our own country around the elections, the past 2 years that we've gone through with our new president, how children are making meaning of it, the violence that we experience on a regular basis, California last night. It feels so rapid and fast, and how will young children actually make meaning of that? So I want to talk about this pivot from teaching to learning, and where I've come from and how I've come to understand it, and what I think it might mean to how we shape our own work together, and most importantly, interdisciplinary work together. So that's the subject of what I wanted to talk about today. And by the way, nobody gave me a time limit. So I'm going to, okay, thanks. So this is the quote on the left, and the quotes in the middle are from the same person who was a principal in a public school in Washington, D.C. Around 2000. And she was talking about, on the left in the blue, the idea that she wanted children and teachers to come to school fired up to learn, that everything should be about, I want to get up and I want to come to school because what happens at school is the most important thing. And that when children come to school, they need to feel love and engagement and connection to what's going on in school. She had this vision of what her school would be, that everyone would work together, teachers and students. And she was challenging herself and her faculty to do that kind of thing. And I think about the vision for what we're trying to do in our educational systems and our development is this idea of creating communities that will be so important as we move through the educational cycle in the next 20 or 30 years. So I want to talk a little bit about, what does success mean in school, but then I'm going to talk a little bit about what success might be for adults. So the success for students is that everyone actually has access to high quality education. And I can tell you right now from all of the work that we do across the United States, that's not true. Not everybody has access. The kind of access that they have is extremely limited, at times oppressive. So access is the first principle that we have to think about. But it's also important that everybody learns that everybody has the opportunity to participate. And participation is not child to teacher, but participation in a community of learners, all of whom are learning at varying degrees and different kinds of rapidity with different kinds of languages. And we need to create a space in which participation is a rule for all of us. They have to acquire tools that help them to learn and to think about how to make meaning of what they're giving. They need to understand how to respond to failure, how to invent, how to engineer, and how to respond to the complex problems of the 21st century. And on the other side of that, we have to also educate with adults in mind. What is it that we want adults to have access to be able to do, and to engage as adults? And those are the literacies and tools that are necessary to join a variety of communities of practice, whether it's engineering or art or medicine or health or community work or teaching. They need to have those tools, but they also need to experience the joy of the camaraderie of people working together and being together in communities in pursuit of making the world a better place. They need to exercise their own agency to contribute their skills and capacities and care to others, to enjoy a quality of life, to sustain their health and well-being and participate in democracy in action. And we need everybody in this country to do this work. And education is the crucible where people will learn those tools, or they will become alienated from the education world and from the capacity to learn in ways that we hope will benefit everyone. So the new challenge is how to get all children, rich and poor, minoritized in multiple ways, to be successful in school and to ensure that all children, rich and poor, are able to learn, think, and act in new ways that fit our new high-tech global world. We have barely begun on the first, and now we are confronted with the second, which is more pressing by day. So I want to frame some big ideas about learning. Learning as a design problem to increase students' abilities and opportunities to actively make meaning, engage, resist, contextualize, and internalize mental schemas about the world around them and their role in it. So I want to give you 4 scenarios and kind of talk my way through those scenarios in relationship to these ideas. So the first one is a description of me teaching skills as a young teacher. The second one is a lesson that I observed in a school in Connecticut. The third one is data from Tammy Handy's dissertation, which she finished this summer, that talks about this pivot from teaching to learning. And then the last is the study that I've been engaged in with Grace is here, and Ina's here, and Vidi's here, and we all worked and labored very hard on this study of 80 children in California and Kansas who worked to learn how to read with other typical children. So the teaching skills. So this is me with a group of my first class of students who came to school tied but with ropes to the bus that they were in. This was in 1977, and Lynchville and a couple other, Lynchburg and a couple other institutions in Virginia had been closed down. And so these children who had been in institutions in Virginia were now being sent to the public school. And that public school, that building behind me and the kids, up until the year that I started teaching there, was the all-black high school in Northern Virginia. And they finally desegregated it. It's Loudoun County, William. And they finally desegregated, and they decided to put all of the kids who were coming out of institutions into the same building. And on the top floor were all of the kids who came out of the institutions, and the bottom floor was all the unwed mothers. All the administrators were men, all of the teachers were women, and all of the paraeducators were black women. So we were just in the throes of reproducing the social strata that existed in that part of Virginia. And I came to school to teach, and there was only a room. There were no chairs, there were no tables, there was nothing for us to work with the kids. So we had to start from the very beginning, and really the only tool I had was operant conditioning. So what I did, I taught kids to respond to me, and then I praised them in lots of different ways. And then as I got furniture, we used chairs and tables and other kinds of things just to help kids know what they should be doing in a space like that, because they'd been living in an institution for several years before they came to school, and they had no idea what actual school was supposed to look like. None of the kids in my classroom spoke. All of them, none of them used sign language. None of them were deaf. But they had a variety of different labels. Who knows what they meant? But they all needed very, 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 very specific and discrete teaching. And I had access to no other kids who could provide models for them so that they would know what was expected in that environment. So I taught everything from standing up when your name was called, to how to walk down the hallway, to how to be in a school play, to how to open a book, to how to look at letters. Everything had to be taught from scratch because there was no foundation there. And everything about that situation was directed from me to the students with very little information or thought from me about what might be the logical first step, because I didn't have a schema for what the curriculum ought to look like, what developmentally made sense for this group of kids. It was just us together trying to figure that out. And so there was a lot of energy being put out by the teacher to shape up skills, and the kids were just existing in that room trying to figure out whether or not this woman was going to go away or not, stop bothering them. So there was lots of experiment on my part, because one of the first things I wanted to do was to figure out, could we use some version of language to interact with each other? And so I was interested in plastic symbols that could actually have a meaning for a child. They didn't physically represent anything, but they were plastic symbols. I was interested in the use of photographs, as in a man, I want an apple, or I want a tape recorder, or I want the balloon, or I want to jump on the trampoline, to see if I could use photographs and they could show me a photograph and I could give them an opportunity to have that thing. We spent a lot of time figuring out what were the things that turned the kids on, so that I could control all sources of reinforcement, so that I could get behavior out of them. And so in this case, I rigged up a little switch for this kid to be able to turn on and off the volume on the speaker, and he was able to do that when he would respond to me, hand me one of those mans. And that was the kind of thing that was going on. Everything in this classroom was teacher to student, figuring out how to individually direct instruct every single kid, and essentially teach 6 different communication systems, 6 different systems of reinforcement, 6 different opportunities to learn. And boy, it was a lonely, isolating, really difficult job to do. And at the end of every day, it was hard to see what the result was, what the impact of what I was doing was in terms of what the kids were learning and growing. And so one of the things that I did to make myself feel better was to call parents on a regular basis to find out, from their perspective, what they were seeing was going on. And so that was how I kind of muddled through these first few years of teaching, basically teaching kids that nobody in that environment had ever taught before. But it was really about a lack of an environment that could actually signal to these kids what they might be doing in order to systematically learn. So fast forward from 1977 to 2002, and I am now studying a group of 2 school districts in Connecticut. And this was, it's 2004, and these were 2 school districts, both of which, according to the state of Connecticut, had reduced the disproportionate identification of children of color in their school districts. And they didn't know how that happened, but they wanted to know why it happened. And so I went into these 2 different school districts with a team of researchers, and we interviewed the superintendent, the central administration. We went and visited with all the principals. We visited with teachers, lots and lots of interviewing, looking at documentation, and then we spent 2 weeks sitting in classrooms where teachers were teaching in both of these districts to try and figure out what the story was and how had they shifted their practice in terms of stopping identifying the kids. And as it turns out, the big deal with this story is that in one case, in one school district, a new superintendent had come in. There were extremely problematic fiscal issues that were going on with the budget in terms of how the budget had been appropriated and who had actually made had gotten the money that should have gone to the education system, and the superintendent had to deal with that in order to keep the school district in business. And so she told her special ed director, I don't want you to identify any more children of color for special education services, and that's how they reduced their numbers. The second, and this, this is like stuff that happens. And in the second district, the superintendent was totally committed to this idea that it was implicit bias and microaggressions in classrooms that produced certain kinds of behavior that would, over time, make kids of color stand out, particularly in terms of their behavior, and she wanted to do something to stop that. And so she brought in an outside consulting group. She formed a team with a Chamber of Commerce and the local religious organizations and the after-school programs, and they went through a massive, intensive training among themselves, and then they involved the school principals and the teachers who were important. And I was looking at the third year of this process, and so I went into a classroom where Chris was leading a lesson. And you can read what's up there, but I'm going to tell you a brief synopsis of it. The teacher picked a lesson from Dick Gregory's autobiography. Dick Gregory was a famous African-American comedian at that time, and he famously fasted for 35 or 40 days to protest racism in our country. And his autobiography was fascinating, but she had picked this chapter of the first time that he felt that he had been racially targeted, which was in a classroom in elementary school by his elementary school teacher. So these seventh grade students read this story together, and then they were broken up into small groups, and they were asked to answer questions like, why did Gregory interpret this experience as racist? What evidence is provided that might have led him to make that a conclusion? Why do you think the teacher's intent, what do you think the teacher's intent was in this situation? What's the text that makes you think this? Have you ever experienced or witnessed a similar situation? What do you think that this group could have done in this situation? What could the other kids have done? So imagine this. This is seventh grade kids, and they're a full gamut of children with all kinds of different learning needs, learning difficulties, behavioral difficulties, as well as typical kids. And what happened was that the kids who could read the text or had read the text were able to sit in their small groups that they had been assigned to and make sure that everybody in their group understood what the text was about. And then they sat together in their groups and began to answer those questions. And what Chris did was to move from group to group and to make sure that they had evidence for everything that they were asserting. So she was coaching them to follow the protocol that they had all been given. And the kids were engaged, incredibly engaged in doing this work. And as we went through that particular school, we saw multiple evidences of the choice of curriculum that was pertinent to the issues that those kids were dealing with in their everyday, in mathematics, in science, in social studies, and in literacy, with skilled teachers who understood how to engage kids in the process of learning and who had set up collaborative interactions between kids so that they would be supported. There were very few behavior problems in these schools, and there wasn't anything special about these kids. They weren't like super good kids. They were just kids who had learned that school was some place that they wanted to be engaged in. And the role of the teacher is what I want you to think about. What the teacher was actually doing to produce that kind of energy, because the effort was on the part of the kids. The kids were doing the work. The teacher was coaching them to do the work, but the teacher wasn't doing all the work. She'd done the work probably the night before, over the weekend. But what she did was Chris facilitated the learning. She directed the students' attention to the questions and the kinds of guidance they needed, but she didn't tell them what to do. She directed them to that. And when her students with disabilities needed support to engage the reading independently, then she pulled aside a group of kids later in the afternoon and she did that work. And then she focused on skills and strategies specific to their needs at another time during the day so that they didn't lose this opportunity to understand what it means to work and learn in this complex way. So this shift from who's doing the work, whose brain is getting activated, the neuroplasticity of the brain itself that gets activated, and we can see it now in places like the MIT lab that are actually looking at what the brain does in different kinds of instructional procedures. And we've got a set of learning scientists that are looking at things like what happens when a teacher does a tell and practice session versus what happens when a teacher does a let's invent, design, or experiment, and then let's talk about what happened. The parts of the brain that get activated in doing that and the ability of the kids to develop tools in different ways are very different. So this perspective that I'm bringing to you is this idea of what happens when the teacher is in charge of the lesson and does the work and provides the feedback and scaffolds very carefully the direct instruction, produces a different kind of impact than the teacher who uses all of the resources of the learning community, the other kids, materials that are appropriate, and gets them engaged in how they might use those tools. They won't do it perfectly, but they will learn to understand how to use and mediate and think about in important ways the tools that they have. What happened in this class is that the lesson that she was teaching didn't just go for one day. It went over a number of days so that the kids had opportunities to come back. She called it a writer's workshop. We can have a conversation about whether or not that's actually what it was. But what's happened in terms of being consistent with learning science is the retention of information lost its centrality to the design and development of mental tools that offered them the opportunity to do the same kind of thing with other kinds of materials. So now they're actually learning for generalization and transfer and the development of these mental models. The other thing that I think the sociocultural perspective brings to us is that thinking is distributed across students, not inside of students. Yes, we think as individuals, but we also, what we think about and how we think is influenced and enriched by the learners that are around us, and their internal knowledge is mapped together. So what Nahid knows and what William knows and what Rick knows and what Neil knows, when we talk together and learn together, we actually map each other's cognitive maps and we become richer, we overlay. And that is really the profound shift and pivot in how we teach and what we might do with young children all the way through their educational experience. So I want to say to you that also that what Chris did is one of the most wildly successful classrooms I've seen in a really long time. So I'm not suggesting that this is going on all the time. It's just something that is happening. Last year, one of our really great doctoral students, Tammy Handy, who graduated this summer, was in Sri Lanka, in the northern province of Sri Lanka, which had a 30-year civil war, the Tamil Sinhalese civil war that raged on for a very long time. And she is also the daughter of a mixed marriage, a Sinhalese and a Tamil mother and father. So they they had that kind of division in their own lives. But Tammy went back to Sri Lanka to find out, in a country where the schools simply didn't operate for a really long time, what happened after the war was declared over, although you all know that Sri Lanka is incredibly unstable right now. The president was deposed, the parliament was shut down. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in the last week, but so it's an unstable environment, but the northern province in particular is extremely unstable. She went there and she worked with kids and teachers in that environment to find out how the teachers thought about their teaching, what they were doing, and to see if she could develop tools that would help the teachers think about how they were teaching in ways that would help them make this pivot from teaching as performance to teaching as a learning coach. And she spent 4 months there. And this is where the teachers started at the beginning of this. These quotes are from the beginning of her intervention. And they're being asked to look at themselves on video for the first time, and then to talk about what they're seeing, what they see, what they notice about their own teaching. And she said, this one teacher said, I noticed that some of them, the students, came to class after the lesson had begun. At the time, I didn't do anything about it and let it go. But when watching the video, I realized that it may have distracted the rest of the class. Other than that, there was nothing in that video. I didn't notice anything else. Now, think about the fact that the teachers have jobs and lots of other people in this community don't have jobs. So if they don't do a good job, they're likely going to lose their job and somebody else will be there to take it. So for them to even trust Tammy enough to have a conversation that might be somewhat critical of their own teaching or reflective of their own teaching, it's a really, really difficult thing. But this is where they were at the beginning. Another teacher says, I noticed in the video that students were looking at an already corrected book, and the rest were copying down the answers. I didn't notice what they were up to when I was teaching. I caught it when I was looking at this video, maybe, but there was some side talk going on. I'm not sure if they were concentrating, but all of them were looking at me and listening. So again, there are these behavior performances that are going on, and the teacher's continuing to teach, and everybody's doing the role that they're supposed to do, but the idea about what the feedback is around the teaching is not coming through. So another teacher says, this was the first time I was observing myself teach. And these are teachers who had taught for a while. It was fun to watch. There were good things and bad things when I watched it as a viewer. I was able to identify the problems in my teaching. I was able to identify them a little bit more. If we look at the positive side, I felt that I was explaining the lesson very well. I also felt that I was maintaining a good energy level. As far as the negatives, I thought I was walking too much in the class, and that was distracting to me. I felt my hand gestures were too much, but in terms of what I saw, I was wondering if it was disturbing students. I felt a bit unsettled when I thought about it. So again, what is my performance as a teacher, and is it affecting something with the kids? So here we begin to see the teachers pivoting from this idea of this, I have the knowledge, I'm going to give it to you, to the student, and pivoting from this idea of teaching to learning. And the teacher says, I've begun to realize how my harsh ways are making the students too afraid in class. Even though I do this for their own good, they don't all understand it the same way. They misunderstand my intentions. Some students know I do it for them. They know the difference, but others, it has a negative impact. I didn't think about that aspect before, that my strict ways might be making them too afraid to learn. I will do something about it, but I don't know what yet. I must think about it more. So here's the beginning. I think you could argue that this person is also beginning to trust Tammy to be able to say something like this, but they're also noticing that what they do has a behavioral impact on the kids. So here's when we begin to talk about this idea of engagement. Let me go back for a second. Yeah. I know they showed more enthusiasm and interest in this lesson. I know that it was because they were enthusiastic about the lesson. That's why they were responding back and forth. So the curriculum is making a difference. If they weren't enthusiastic, they wouldn't have bothered to comment or anything. They would have remained quietly. I saw that they are drawing and quickly working out the answers. They explored alternative methods. So all that this showed me is that they were interested in this lesson and thinking about how to solve the problem. So what I want you to think about is when we over-rely on a view of teaching as something that adults perform, it renders this fragmented perspective on what transpires in classrooms and other places that produce teacher and student learning. In contrast, understanding that students actively participate in learning changes the nature of teacher roles and identities in teachers' own learning processes, that they increasingly master their practice through experience and participation. So the teachers are making these pivots very gradually, but they're very conscious at the same time of what the institutional constraints are that are pressing down on them to act as teachers. So from Tammy's dissertation, I became extremely intrigued by how it's possible for somebody who's grown up and practiced in this role of teacher as the font of knowledge, the organizer of the classroom, the deliverer of all information. What can we draw on from different disciplines as tools that might help teachers to begin to think about their own practice in novel ways? So one of them is anthropology, how affordances and constraints embedded in who we are and how we view the world and how we practice. Sociological, how do the structural inequities, like the ones that I mentioned in Sri Lanka, operate and influence how we understand, think, and act in the world? So what are the things that are happening? Remember in Connecticut, the educational policy in Connecticut and the world in one school district really changed the practice of teachers in a very specific kind of way, and they changed the practice of the teachers in the other district in a very specific way. Two very different responses to the same mandate from the state because the local institutional practice told them to do different kinds of things. So thinking about the sociology of this becomes a really important tool. What if we just looked at the sociological implications of what teachers were doing and didn't try to directly intervene? What if we looked at the structures? What if we were changing how school actually operates? Would that be a more powerful change agent than trying to do this one teacher at a time? What about the epistemological notions that are embedded in some of the conversation? How do the constraints and affordances of histories, that is the history of a place, of a community, the history that individual people bring to a situation, the institutional structures, the inequities that guide and form how we make sense of the world and are embedded inside of us when we make decisions about who to include and who participates, and achieve personal, psychological, spiritual, economic, and relational needs. What if we began to, have conversations and open up dialogue among teachers about their epistemological beliefs about how the world operates? One attempt to do that in a very faulty way was the culture of poverty discussion, which is most recently in the last year come back one more time. Daniel Patrick Moynihan's work on the culture of poverty that was followed up by Ruby Payne's work, and I know Jennifer did work on that. Well, all of that's coming back again, and they're drawing on the original study that was done in Cuba to make an argument that we have to deal with this construct of a culture of poverty, but we need research that helps us unpack that at a more fundamental level. And then from a biological point of view, how can we take advantage of neuroplasticity in the brain and epigenetics in learning? That is that we actually change our genetic code because of the people that we are near. We have now studies that show that that's happening. What does that mean for how our brains are operating and what we're doing? And it's really scary when you think about some of the activity that's going on in the U.S. right now when you begin to think about that kind of thing. The last thing I want to talk about is the literacy intervention that we've been working on here at KU. This was a study of 80 children. 40 of them were in California, 40 of them were here in Kansas and Missouri. They were spread across 9 schools in Kansas and Missouri and 7 schools in California. All of the children, in order for the children to participate in the study, they had to have IQs of under 50. They had to be able to identify pictures. And Leslie, do you remember another thing? The other criteria?
Be able to sit still and respond to.
Yes, thank you. Yep. So we got a set of kids, and our big dream was to take an evidence-based curriculum for teaching reading and to deliver it in general education classrooms where the children that we were working with that had disabilities were already members of that classroom. And then we went out to schools to recruit. And we discovered that we couldn't find places in Kansas and Missouri where that was the case. We only found classrooms that were separate classrooms in schools. And so then we had to persuade a set of principals and teachers of the value of them doing inclusive teaching of reading in classrooms where they had never had kids with disabilities before, kids that had this degree of disability in their classrooms. And what we did was we put 20 of the kids that we were working with into general education classrooms during reading, and they got what they would have gotten if they'd stayed in the special education classroom. This is what we called business as usual. But they got to do it with general ed peers. And then for the other 20 kids, we put them into classrooms where they had been welcomed, and we put them also in a small reading group with typical peers, and they got the evidence-based reading program that we had designed. And they had 2 elements to this reading program. One of them was, let's teach you what letters and words, or letters sound like. Let's help you put them into words. Let's put those words into sentences, and let's read those sentences, and let's make meaning out of them. That was part of what they did. A very, very behaviorally driven, discrete trial kind of thing, but we had typical kids participating in that, and a puppet named Mo who got really excited. Yeah, I love it. I love that way you called that word. So the teachers all had to be great actors. And then the other part of the program that ended up being really exciting was it was called Building with Stories, and the entire team took reading books that the teachers had identified and adapted and modified them so that kids that didn't have good finger strength could actually turn pages, and there were big cues about which picture to look at on a page, and then there was a regular story reading thing. What do you think the brown bear's going to do next? And what's it going to sound like when they go through the mud? That kind of thing. And so building with stories and building with words were part of the program. And 5 times during the year, 5 times during the year, these children were tested on their reading skills and whether or not they were making progress in reading. And if you talk to Vidi or Grace or Ina or Leslie about what actually happened, they can tell you a lot of exciting things, especially Vidi. But we did that, and the big news over all of this is that the kids that were in the blue group, the group that had, I'm sorry, the red group, the group on the top of that bar graph, made significantly more progress in learning to read than the kids who were in the business as usual group. They had more peer buddies, they engaged more readily, and they made more reading progress on a number of measures, including, to our delight, comprehension. This is a huge study. It's the first study that the Institute for Educational Science ever funded for kids with this kind of significant disability, and it's a huge study because we got that many kids with this kind of significant need in a study, and we taught them in general education classrooms, and it was a mix of the kind of direct instruction that I described in the beginning that I was doing in my classroom years ago in these isolated units, imported into a situation where typical kids were part of the modeling and the affordances of what was going on, and they got opportunities to sit in and do things that people typically would not think they were capable of doing. And what happened was they just learned like crazy. We had kids that were nonverbal that started talking. And the kind of thing that happened anecdotally as a result of this, that we don't have big data for, was pretty phenomenal. But what happened was that the teachers, the general education teachers, became interested, and the typical kids became interested, and the kinds of friendships. And so we have a study that will be coming out just on the social validity of what we did and what it meant for teachers and for kids alike, as well as the main study. But this idea about the relationship between how we think about what we're setting up in classrooms for all kids, how we actually do that, I think there are some final ideas about this shift that I want to share with you. And it involves asking questions about what does it actually take to create a scenario like this or the one that Chris had? In what context, with what materials, and what is it that we really need teachers to learn and be able to do in order to provide that kind of learning opportunity? How does meaning making and engagement occur for kids? We really don't know all of the ins and outs about that. We need more research on how that actually happens. What are the neurological signs that tell us that this is happening? And we're doing research, we're advancing research now on the use of monitors that we can put on kids and really find out what's happening with their eye tracking and their affect and their emotion and their engagement as they're learning, because we want to know more about what that means and are there archetypes that we can begin to use. What role does communication and the new literacies play in facilitating this? So if a kid comes to school and already knows how to poke at an iPad or a phone and expects information to come to them in particular kinds of ways, what are the affordances of that as we try to structure and organize an educational experience for that kid? And then what does that mean about how we use curriculum and where the curriculum comes from? So learning is more than storing information. It's the ability to improvise, reorganize, challenge, and remediate what is known or assumed based on new information. While cognitive psychology has been consumed with how individuals receive, order, produce, and create, sociocultural psychologists have been interested in how the world around individuals mediate and shape what individuals attend to, the tools they use, and how they gain expertise through participation in social interaction. And what I'm going to leave you with today is this challenge that if we are only doing this work as educators talking to each other, it's not going to be sufficient for us to solve the problem of what education is going to become. And for those of you that are thinking about the role of artificial intelligence in our classrooms and what that might mean about how teachers need to shift what they understand and what they do, I think it's critical. Jamie's sitting up at the top. He's really involved in thinking about universal designs for learning. That's a very fruitful field, but it's very nascent. We don't know a lot about what the impact of different kinds of designs, but I want to encourage all of you to work on this pivot from what we tell to how we design and engage our students in learning, and to understand learning as a lifelong enterprise in which we are all engaged. And aren't we lucky, I would say, lucky, lucky, lucky to have the roles and be in a place like KU where this kind of learning we're able to do all of that. So I want to thank all of you for sitting here and for listening and for caring about the work that we do. It's a real pleasure, and I appreciate it. Thank you. Sure.
Do folks have questions they would like to ask?
So what do you think about this idea, this pivot that I'm proposing from teaching to learning? How do you think about it for yourself? And I'm sure some of you wonder, what does that mean that a teacher would do? And I've got a question, the word teacher. Yeah.
How do you do this in your own, when you're teaching graduate students? How do you model this for?
They're all there.
I could ask them. How do you model this? It's one thing to teach kids.
Right. Well, my view is it's easier to do it with graduate students than it is to do it with kids. But it's hard to do it because they don't want to be wrong, and they don't want to fail, and they don't want to look foolish in front of their colleagues. And so all of those things operate. So figuring out what the participation strategies are, because participation and activity are key to actually creating the opportunity to talk. And of course, everybody that teaches has their own preferences for learning, because they're also our own preferences. And ask them all, they'll go like, could she stop assigning so many readings? Oh, yeah, I read a good book. You guys want to read that? Durable Inequalities. Yeah. We did that last night. Other questions? Yeah, Joe.
So how might schools of education incorporate more of the biological neuroscience into what we do?
Well, first of all, we need to invite some biological science people to sit with us and look at the kind of work that we're doing and ask the questions about what could they measure and help us actually accomplish. What would we learn by knowing what's going on in the brain in particular activities, and how might that inspire a different kind of learning mechanism? Some of the places that I spend time in are doing that on a daily basis. So they've got public schools that are doing that kind of measuring of what's going on with kids' neurosciences while they're learning. And that's producing some really interesting data on the things that teachers can do more of, because they're getting pretty immediate feedback based on how kids are responding to what they're doing. But I think we could do it here. I know Ed's been to the MIT lab and looked at some of the work that they've been doing, and I think all of that stuff is importable, but it really can't just be the neuroscience guys. It's got to be the computer science and the engineering guys that are with us on that. And I think there's some people here at KU that would be really excited if we propose this. And there's funding. There's funding that we could do it with.
So how does this, all of our education programs have a certain logic to them and a history and a way of being, and hours invested and so on and so forth. What are the implications for teacher education of this? I mean, should we blow it up and start over again, or what do we do with teacher education?
Well, I don't know how you can learn to be a teacher if you don't spend time in practice settings with a really significant amount of time. But those practice settings have to be places where the work of the practice setting is also committed to talking out loud and shaping and discussing and providing feedback on a regular basis. But there are models for how to do that around the country. And I think it's a huge endeavor, and it shifts the role of what faculty who are in teacher education would do. But it's very powerful. Is Marty here? Marty, I don't see Marty, but Marty Elford just came back from visiting overseas, talking to people about what she does about feedback to teachers in practice. And there are technologies that we could be using to do that as well. And what Tammy did came out of some of Marty's work. This idea of video, watching yourself teach, but having mediated conversations about it, finding meaning and having that. And what the online program afforded us the opportunity to do is to really focus on what happens when a teacher tapes themselves, and then the teacher basically codes their own videotape, and the supervising academic does the same thing, and then they read each other's notes, and then they have a conversation about it. What happens and what's the power of doing that? And what we're finding is it's some of the best coaching. Are you doing that now, Deb? Are you part of that effort? Somebody here doing that? Yeah, you. Yeah. Yeah, and you could use Athena and just simply make some comments and have that just go to the person, but the power of this is in the conversation that happens after all of that coding happens, and then there's leaps forward in terms of how people teach. But you've got to teach to be a good teacher. And I think a lot of schools of ed have that backwards, too much didactic stuff, not enough activity. But if the activity isn't mediated, it's also not valuable. So there's a real shift in how people do things.
It occurs as you're talking that maybe this is an interesting way of doing our own teaching evaluation, or thinking about different ways of evaluating teaching for us,
Yeah.
our peers.
Yeah. I think for people that are really interested in doing it, it's pretty exciting. And by the way, could be good, really great research.
Wasn't the national board kind of moving in this direction? It's lost some of its luster, but that was
Yes.
intensive kind of
Oh,
professional
yeah.
development.
Oh,
Just
yeah.
Not a lot of people
Yeah.
got to it.
Yeah. And, one of the benefits of living in a lot of different places is you learn a lot of different things. And the state of Washington has an independent professional standards board, independent of the state agency. And it's made up of teachers who govern their own standards building and that kind of thing. And that was all part of the national board, the original genesis of the national boards, that like medical boards that are governed by medical doctors, they put that all together. The PESB board, the Professional Educator Standards Board, is designed by educators about their standards, and they have more teachers in the country that are certified as national board teachers than any place else in the country because of that relationship. I would not argue that they have, a great education system, but that part of what they're doing that gives teachers agency is really interesting to me.
Any last questions, comments? Let's thank Elizabeth again.
Yep.